The night of August 17th, 1966. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The jungle was never quiet. Insects provided a constant background hum, broken by the occasional call of night birds and the rustling of unseen animals moving through undergrowth so dense that visibility dropped to less than 5 meters in any direction. In the darkness, 20 meters from a known Viet Cong trail, a man lay motionless. Australian. Special Air Service. He'd been in this position for 6 hours. He would remain for 6 more if necessary. His face was painted green and black. His weapon, an L1A1 self-loading rifle, was wrapped in cloth to prevent any metallic reflection. He breathed slowly, shallowly, through his nose. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply waited. 3 kilometers away, in a village that officially supported the South Vietnamese government but secretly provided supplies to the National Liberation Front, a woman was receiving information that would change her understanding of the war. She was Viet Cong, had been since 1963, when American advisors had first arrived in significant numbers. She'd fought the French as a teenager, working as a courier and eventually as a fighter. She'd seen combat. She understood warfare. She knew the Americans with their helicopters and artillery. She knew the South Vietnamese ARVN forces with their inconsistent commitment and variable competence. But the Australians were different, and in the months to come, she would come to hate them with an intensity that surprised her. This is the story of how Australian Special Air Service soldiers became the most feared and hated enemy force among Viet Cong fighters, particularly the women who fought alongside men in the jungle warfare of Vietnam. How a relatively small contingent of soldiers from a nation of 12 million people created a psychological impact far beyond their numbers. How their methods, their patience, their willingness to fight the Viet Cong on the Viet Cong's own terms, fundamentally disrupted the insurgent tactics that had worked against larger American and South Vietnamese forces. And how that disruption, documented in captured diaries, post-war interviews, and the operational records of both sides, revealed truths about jungle warfare, about cultural approaches to combat, and about why certain military units achieve effectiveness far beyond what their size would suggest. To understand why the Viet Cong hated the Australian SAS, you need to understand what the Viet Cong expected from Western forces. By 1966, the National Liberation Front had been fighting for 5 years. They'd developed tactics that worked. They controlled territory, not by holding it in conventional military terms, but by making it too dangerous for government forces to operate there. They moved at night. They used the jungle. They struck quickly and disappeared. They planted booby traps and mines. They leveraged local support, voluntary or coerced, to maintain intelligence networks that warned of approaching government forces. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Against American forces, these tactics were largely effective. The Americans fought with massive firepower, artillery, airstrikes, helicopter assaults, B-52 bombing runs. When Americans encountered Viet Cong forces, the typical response was to call in overwhelming fire support. The kill ratio favored the Americans, but the Viet Cong could sustain losses that would be unacceptable to American public opinion, and more importantly, the Americans were predictable. They used the same bases. They patrolled the same routes. They operated during the same hours. They made noise. Their helicopters announced their presence. Their radio communications could be monitored. Their supply chains were visible targets. The Viet Cong had learned to fight the Americans by avoiding their strengths and exploiting their patterns. Don't stand and fight against superior firepower. Strike quickly, inflict casualties, withdraw before artillery or air support arrives. Use terrain the Americans found difficult. Dense jungle, rice paddies, village areas where civilians complicated targeting decisions, plant mines along predictable patrol routes, ambush supply convoys, attack isolated outposts. Create an environment where American forces never felt safe, even in supposedly secure areas. The South Vietnamese ARVN forces presented a different challenge, but one the Viet Cong had mastered. ARVN units varied enormously in quality. Some were well-trained and motivated, Others were poorly led, inadequately supplied, and riddled with Viet Cong informants. The Viet Cong infiltrated ARVN units. They knew which battalions would fight and which would retreat at the first sign of serious resistance. They planned operations around this knowledge. Target the weak units. Avoid the effective ones. Undermine government control incrementally. Village by village, district by district. This system worked. By 1966, the Viet Cong controlled or contested much of rural South Vietnam. The government held the cities and major towns. The countryside belonged to whoever could project force there at any given moment. And at night, that was almost always the Viet Cong. American and ARVN forces withdrew to their bases after dark. The Viet Cong owned the night. This wasn't propaganda. This was the operational reality of the war in 1966. Then, the Australians arrived. Not in overwhelming numbers. The Australian task force that deployed to Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 numbered approximately 4,500 men, plus support elements. This included 2 infantry battalions rotating through deployment, artillery, armour, engineers, and logistics. A tiny fraction of the American force in Vietnam, which by 1966 exceeded 200,000 men and would eventually reach over 500,000. The Australians were a footnote, a minor Allied contribution to an American war. They were assigned one province, Phuoc Tuy, a coastal region southeast of Saigon that was heavily contested between government and Viet Cong forces. The Australian approach to operations in Phuoc Tuy was different from the American approach. The Australians had recent experience in counterinsurgency warfare. They'd fought communist insurgents in Malaya during the 1950s, a campaign that had ultimately succeeded in defeating the insurgency. The lessons from Malaya shaped Australian doctrine. Don't chase the insurgents with large, noisy operations that give them time to escape. Instead, establish a presence in contested areas. Patrol constantly. Disrupt insurgent movement. Cut their supply lines. Make them react to you rather than letting them dictate the tempo of operations. And most importantly, be patient. Counterinsurgency isn't won with decisive battles. It's won by gradually denying the insurgents the ability to operate. The Australian SAS took this approach to its logical extreme. The Special Air Service Regiment, Australia's elite Special Operations Unit, had been formed in 1957, modelled on the British SAS. The first SAS squadron deployed to Vietnam in 1965, rotating out after a year. The second squadron arrived in 1966. These weren't large units. An SAS squadron numbered roughly 100 men, organised into multiple troops of 16 men each, further divided into 4-man patrols. 4 men. That was the basic operational element. 4 highly trained soldiers, inserted by helicopter into remote jungle areas, tasked with reconnaissance, surveillance, and disruption of Viet Cong operations. 4-man patrols seem insignificant in a war where American operations involved battalions and brigades. But the SAS patrols operated differently. They didn't announce their presence, they moved silently. They established observation posts and waited for days or weeks, watching Viet Cong trails and base areas. When they engaged the enemy, it was on their terms, not the enemy's. They used ambushes. They called in artillery or airstrikes on targets they'd positively identified, and then they disappeared back into the jungle before the Viet Cong could respond effectively. The Australian SAS selection and training process was brutal. Only volunteers were accepted. The selection course lasted 6 weeks initially, then expanded to longer periods as standards increased. Candidates were tested on physical endurance, navigation, ability to operate under stress, and psychological suitability. The failure rate was high. Roughly 70 to 80% of candidates didn't complete selection. Those who passed underwent additional specialized training, parachute insertion, helicopter operations, advanced weapons training, jungle survival, combat medicine, communications. The goal was to produce soldiers who could operate independently in small teams, behind enemy lines, for extended periods, without support. This training created a particular type of soldier, self-reliant, disciplined, patient, capable of making independent decisions under pressure. The 4-man patrol structure required this. There was no commanding officer looking over your shoulder, no platoon sergeant to provide guidance. You and 3 other men, alone in the jungle, often out of radio contact for hours at a time. You made your own decisions, you assessed your own risks, and you accepted responsibility for the consequences. The woman in the village near Phuoc Tuy Province would encounter the consequences of this training in ways she didn't expect. She'd been assigned to a Viet Cong main force unit, one of the better trained and better equipped formations operating in the province. Her unit had successfully ambushed ARVN patrols. They'd conducted attacks on government outposts. They'd planted mines that had destroyed vehicles and killed soldiers. They were effective. They knew the terrain. They had local support. They'd been operating in this area for years. But in late 1966, things began to change. Patrols that had previously moved freely through the jungle started encountering problems. Men disappeared. Not killed in firefights. Just gone. Sentries at base camps were found dead, killed silently in the night. Supply caches that should have been secure were destroyed by artillery fire so accurate it suggested someone had marked the exact coordinates. Trails that had been safe for years became dangerous. Ambushes that should have succeeded failed because the targets knew they were coming. The Viet Cong leadership initially attributed these problems to bad luck or increased ARVN aggressiveness. But as incidents accumulated, a pattern emerged. These weren't random events. Someone was watching them. Someone was tracking their movements. Someone was calling in fire on targets they shouldn't have been able to find. And unlike American or ARVN operations, which were usually noisy and obvious, these watchers were invisible. They left no trace, they made no sound. They simply appeared, struck, and vanished. The psychological impact of this was profound. Viet Cong forces were accustomed to being the ones who watched and waited. They were the guerrillas. They were supposed to have the initiative. They chose when and where to fight. They controlled the night. But against the Australian SAS, they were the ones being hunted. And they didn't know how to respond. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you defend against someone who knows where you are, but you don't know where they are? How do you maintain morale when your soldiers disappear without warning and nobody knows what happened to them? The operational methods of Australian SAS patrols were specifically designed to create this psychological effect. A typical patrol would be inserted by helicopter into a remote area, often at dawn or dusk to minimize detection. The insertion point would be kilometers from the actual objective to avoid alerting Viet Cong forces to the patrol's presence. Once on the ground, the patrol would move slowly and carefully to their designated area of operations. Movement discipline was absolute. No talking, hand signals only. Each step carefully placed to avoid making noise. Progress measured in hundreds of meters per hour, not kilometers. Once in position, the patrol would establish a hide, a concealed observation post where they could watch enemy activity without being seen. The hide would be camouflaged carefully. Natural materials only, nothing artificial that might reflect light or look out of place. The patrol would remain in the hide for days, observing. They'd watch Viet Cong forces move along trails. They'd count numbers, note equipment, identify leaders. They'd record the patterns of activity. When did people move? How many? Where did they come from and where did they go? What were they carrying? This information was radioed back to headquarters, where intelligence analysts compiled it with reports from other patrols to build a comprehensive picture of Viet Cong operations in the area. But the patrols did more than just watch. When targets of opportunity presented themselves, they engaged. An SAS patrol might set up an ambush along a trail they'd been watching, wait for a Viet Cong group to enter the kill zone, open fire with devastating effect, and then withdraw rapidly before reinforcements could arrive. The ambush techniques used by SAS patrols were learned from British operations in Malaya and refined through experience in Vietnam. The key was achieving surprise and overwhelming firepower in the first seconds of contact. The patrol would position themselves with overlapping fields of fire covering the kill zone. They'd wait until the enemy force was completely exposed, and then they'd open fire simultaneously. In the first 5 to 10 seconds of an SAS ambush, the volume of fire was extraordinary. 4 men with automatic weapons, grenades, and claymore mines could inflict catastrophic casualties on a much larger force before that force could react effectively. But the ambush was only successful if the patrol could withdraw safely afterward. This required planning, multiple withdrawal routes identified in advance, rehearsal of the withdrawal procedure, designated rally points where the patrol would regroup if separated during contact, and most importantly, speed and silence during the withdrawal. The goal was to be gone before the enemy could organize a response, hit hard, move fast, disappear. For Viet Cong forces encountering these tactics, the experience was horrifying. You're moving along a trail you've used safely dozens of times. Suddenly, without warning, the jungle erupts. Automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Explosions. Men falling. And before you can return fire effectively, before you can locate the source of the shooting, it stops. When you cautiously advance to where the shots came from, there's nothing. Spent shell casings, maybe some blood if you hit them. But no bodies, no equipment, no indication of which direction they went. They're gone. This pattern repeated across Phuoc Tuy Province throughout 1967 and 1968. SAS patrols established a presence in areas the Viet Cong had considered secure. They watched, they waited. They struck when the opportunity was right. The numbers might seem small, 4-man patrols, perhaps a dozen patrols operating simultaneously across the province, but the impact was disproportionate to the size of the force. The Viet Cong couldn't move freely anymore. Every trail could be watched, every base camp could be under observation. Every operation carried the risk that someone was out there, unseen, waiting. The woman who'd been confident in her unit's capabilities found that confidence eroding. She'd been in firefights with Americans and ARVN forces. Those engagements, while dangerous, were comprehensible. You saw the enemy, you understood what they were trying to do, you could shoot back. But against the Australians, particularly the SAS, combat was different. You never saw them, they saw you. And by the time you knew they were there, people were dying. Post-war interviews with former Viet Cong fighters, including the woman whose experiences form part of this narrative, revealed consistent themes. The Australians were described as quiet. They moved through the jungle without making noise, something Vietnamese fighters had thought only they could do. They were described as patient. Unlike Americans, who seemed to want quick results and relied on firepower to achieve them, the Australians would wait, days, weeks if necessary, just watching, and they were described as ghosts. You couldn't find them. You couldn't predict where they'd be. They appeared, struck, and vanished. One former Viet Cong fighter described it in an interview conducted in the 1990s. The Americans were loud. We always knew where they were. We could avoid them or prepare ambushes because we heard their helicopters, their radios, their movement. The Australians were different. They came silently. They watched us. We didn't know they were there until we were dead. We learned to fear the Australians more than the Americans, even though there were far fewer of them. Another interview, with a female fighter who'd operated in Phuoc Tuy Province, was more direct. We hated them. The Americans we could fight. The Australians hunted us like animals. They knew the jungle as well as we did. They moved like we did. But they had better weapons, better equipment, better support, and they never stopped. You couldn't negotiate with them. You couldn't bribe them. You couldn't scare them off. They just kept coming, quietly, patiently, until they killed you. This hatred wasn't irrational. It was a response to tactical effectiveness. The Australian SAS had taken the Viet Cong's own methods and used them against the Viet Cong. Stealth, patience, knowledge of terrain, surprise. These were supposed to be Viet Cong advantages, but the Australians had mastered them and added superior training, better equipment, and more reliable support to the mix. The result was a force that could operate more effectively in the jungle than the Viet Cong themselves. The numbers support this assessment. During 1966 to 1971, the period of heaviest Australian involvement in Vietnam, SAS patrols conducted thousands of reconnaissance missions and hundreds of offensive operations. The kill ratio achieved by SAS patrols was extraordinary. Official figures suggest Australian SAS killed approximately 500 Viet Cong fighters while suffering 14 deaths in combat, a kill ratio of approximately 35-1. Even accounting for the difficulties in confirming enemy casualties in jungle warfare and the tendency of all militaries to overestimate enemy losses, the ratio was remarkable. But numbers alone don't explain the psychological impact. The Viet Cong had sustained heavy casualties against American forces without losing morale or operational effectiveness. They accepted losses as part of revolutionary warfare. What made the Australian SAS different wasn't just that they killed Viet Cong fighters. It was how they did it. The silence, the invisibility, the sense of being constantly watched, the inability to predict or prevent attacks. These factors created a level of psychological pressure that exceeded the raw casualty numbers. The Viet Cong response to the Australian SAS threat evolved over time. Initially, they tried to adapt their own tactics, move more carefully, post more sentries, avoid predictable patterns, use different trails, change base camp locations more frequently. These were reasonable countermeasures, the same ones that had worked against other threats. But against the SAS, they had limited effectiveness. The problem was that SAS patrols didn't need to follow you. They didn't need to track your movements in real time. They could simply position themselves along likely routes in areas where Viet Cong forces had to operate and wait for targets to present themselves. The geography of Phuoc Tuy Province made this particularly effective. The province contained critical terrain features that the Viet Cong couldn't avoid. Routes connecting coastal areas to inland bases, water sources during the dry season, rice-producing villages that supplied food. The long high hills, a rugged area that served as a Viet Cong stronghold. Australian intelligence identified these key areas and positioned SAS patrols to observe and interdict Viet Cong movement through them. The Viet Cong could change their specific routes, but they couldn't abandon entire areas without losing operational capability. One particular incident, documented in both Australian and captured Viet Cong records, illustrates how this worked. In February 1967, an SAS patrol was inserted into an area near the Long High Hills. Their mission was reconnaissance, identifying Viet Cong routes and base areas. The patrol established a hide overlooking a trail junction. They remained in position for 5 days, observing intermittent Viet Cong movement. On the 5th day, a larger group appeared. Approximately 15 fighters, well armed, moving with confidence. They were a main force unit, not local guerrillas. The patrol leader made the decision to engage. The ambush was textbook. The Viet Cong force entered the kill zone completely unaware they were being watched. The SAS patrol waited until all 15 were exposed, no cover available, maximum vulnerability. Then they opened fire. The initial burst lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Multiple Viet Cong fighters went down immediately. The survivors scattered, some attempting to return fire, others seeking cover. But the patrol had positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire. There was no effective cover in the kill zone. Within 30 seconds, the engagement was over. The patrol conducted a quick assessment. Multiple confirmed casualties. No Australian injuries. They collected some documents and weapons, then executed their withdrawal plan. The withdrawal took them several kilometers away from the ambush site, moving through dense jungle where tracking was difficult. They established a temporary position, radioed their report, and waited. Within hours, they heard helicopter sounds from the direction of the ambush, Viet Cong reinforcements searching the area. But by then, the SAS patrol was long gone. They remained in the area for another 3 days, observing the Viet Cong response. The enemy brought in a larger force, secured the area, evacuated their casualties, but they never located the patrol that had conducted the ambush. The Australians watched them search, documented their procedures, and eventually withdrew when their mission time expired. For the Viet Cong unit that had been ambushed, the experience was demoralizing. They'd lost approximately 8 fighters, with several more wounded. The casualties themselves were significant, but the manner of the attack was worse. No warning, no indication they'd been under observation. The enemy had chosen the perfect moment to strike, had achieved complete surprise, and had escaped without being located. The survivors' report back to their commanders emphasized the psychological impact. The Australians were different. They fought like Viet Cong, but better. This psychological dimension became increasingly important as Australian operations continued. The Viet Cong had always relied on morale and commitment to sustain their forces despite material disadvantages. Revolutionary ideology, nationalism, belief in eventual victory, these factors helped Viet Cong fighters endure hardship and casualties. But ideology couldn't protect you from an enemy you couldn't see. Commitment couldn't help you when you didn't know if you were being watched at any given moment. The uncertainty created by SAS operations eroded the confidence that had sustained Viet Cong forces. Female fighters in Viet Cong units experienced this psychological pressure acutely. Women had played significant roles in Vietnamese resistance movements since the war against France. They served as fighters, medics, intelligence operatives, political officers, and in logistics roles. In some units, women comprised 20 to 30% of the force. They were expected to demonstrate the same courage and capability as male fighters. But courage requires a certain understanding of risk. When you can't assess the risk, when any moment might bring sudden death from an unseen enemy, courage becomes harder to maintain. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. One account from a female Viet Cong fighter described her experience in late 1967. Her unit was moving supplies from a coastal cache to an inland base. They'd made this journey dozens of times. They knew the route. They knew the safe stopping points. They'd established procedures for security. But this time, as they moved through a rubber plantation, they started noticing signs, small disturbances in the undergrowth that might mean nothing or might mean someone had passed through recently. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves. Things a civilian wouldn't notice but a trained fighter recognized as potential indicators. The unit leader called a halt. They established a defensive perimeter and sent scouts to investigate. The scouts found nothing definite, no clear tracks, no obvious signs of enemy presence, but the indicators were there. Something felt wrong. The unit leader made the decision to abandon the planned route and use an alternate path, even though it would add hours to their journey and require crossing more exposed terrain. They moved carefully, security heightened, everyone alert. Nothing happened. They reached the base without incident. But the entire unit was exhausted, not just from the physical effort, but from the sustained psychological tension of knowing they might be under observation. Later, they learned that an Australian patrol had indeed been in the area, not where they'd been travelling, but close enough that their changed route might have saved them from an ambush, or the patrol might have been observing something else entirely. They never knew for certain. But the incident reinforced what they'd been learning. You couldn't assume safety anywhere. The Australians could be watching at any time, and you wouldn't know until they decided to reveal themselves. This constant uncertainty wore down Viet Cong forces in ways that conventional combat didn't. In a firefight, no matter how dangerous, you knew what was happening. You could see the enemy, assess the situation, make decisions. Against Australian SAS patrols, you often didn't know anything until it was too late. This created a kind of pervasive stress that accumulated over time. Fighters became jumpy, hypervigilant, exhausted from the constant mental burden of trying to detect threats that might not be there. The Australian approach to counterinsurgency warfare in Phuoc Tuy Province wasn't limited to SAS operations. The conventional infantry battalions also adopted tactics that differed from American methods. Australian infantry conducted extensive patrolling, maintained persistent presence in contested areas, and emphasized small unit actions over large sweeps. But the SAS operations were the most psychologically effective because they targeted Viet Cong forces in areas the Viet Cong considered secure. You might expect government forces near cities or along major roads, but deep in the jungle, in remote base areas, you expected safety. The SAS denied that safety. One particularly effective SAS tactic involved targeting Viet Cong leadership and infrastructure. Four-man patrols would spend weeks observing base areas, identifying key individuals, political officers, unit commanders. Technical specialists. Once identified, these individuals became priority targets. The SAS would either conduct direct action, ambushing the target, or call in artillery or airstrikes. The result was a steady attrition of experienced Viet Cong leadership and cadre, the people who held units together and maintained operational effectiveness. The Viet Cong had dealt with leadership losses before. The war had been going on for years. People died, people were captured, new leaders emerged to replace them. This was expected in revolutionary warfare. But the rate of leadership attrition in Phuoc Tuy Province during heavy Australian operations was unsustainable, and the manner of the losses created additional problems. When a leader died in an obvious battle, killed by artillery or airstrikes after a major engagement, their death could be understood in military terms. When a leader simply disappeared or was found dead without warning, killed by an enemy nobody had seen, the effect on unit morale was worse. Captured Viet Cong documents from this period reveal the internal struggles of units operating in Phuoc Tuy Province. One document, a political officer's report, described declining morale, increasing difficulty recruiting locally, and problems maintaining discipline. The report attributed these problems primarily to Australian operations, specifically mentioning the special soldiers who move silently and strike without warning. The report recommended requesting reinforcement from outside the province and avoiding certain areas entirely until the tactical situation improved. Another document, a diary kept by a Viet Cong fighter, included this entry from March 1968. "We lost 3 more people today. The Australians. We never saw them. We never heard them. They just killed Bin and Hung, and wounded Phuong so badly he'll probably die." The wounded man said he only saw one Australian, for maybe 2 seconds, before he was shot. One Australian. But we found shell casings from at least 3 or 4 weapons. They were all around us, and we didn't know. How do you fight ghosts? This ghost characterization appeared repeatedly in Viet Cong descriptions of Australian SAS. It wasn't just a metaphor, it reflected the genuine confusion and fear created by an enemy who could appear and disappear without detection. Vietnamese culture included traditional beliefs in spirits and supernatural entities. While most Viet Cong fighters were educated in Marxist-Leninist ideology that rejected such beliefs, the cultural background remained. And when you're exhausted, stressed, and facing an enemy you can't understand in conventional military terms, cultural archetypes reassert themselves. The Australians became ghosts, spirits, supernatural threats, because rational military explanations seemed inadequate. This psychological dimension was something the SAS cultivated deliberately. They understood that their impact came not just from casualties inflicted, but from the psychological pressure they created. Every patrol aimed to reinforce the message: you are being watched, you are vulnerable, nowhere is safe. The tactics reflected this: selective targeting rather than indiscriminate fire, precision ambushes that left survivors to report what had happened, deliberate patterns of activity that forced the Viet Cong to spread resources defending multiple areas simultaneously. The cultural aspects of Australian operations also mattered. Australian soldiers came from a society that valued egalitarianism, informal relationships, and skepticism of authority. This translated into military units that emphasized practical competence over rigid hierarchy. Officers and enlisted men in SAS patrols worked together with less formality than in American or South Vietnamese units. Decisions were made collectively when time permitted. Every man in the patrol was expected to be capable of independent action if separated from the group. This fostered initiative and adaptability. Additionally, many Australian soldiers had grown up in rural areas, familiar with bushcraft and outdoor skills. They understood how to move quietly through rough terrain, how to read natural signs, how to remain concealed. These were skills that couldn't be taught quickly. They required years of experience. The Viet Cong had these skills too, learned growing up in rural Vietnam. But the Australians matched them and added superior equipment and training to the mix. The combination was formidable. The equipment used by SAS patrols was carefully selected for jungle operations. The L1A1 self-loading rifle was reliable, accurate, and chambered in 7.62mm NATO, providing good range and penetration. M16 rifles, American-made but lighter and with higher rate of fire, were also used by some patrols. For close-range combat, some patrol members carried shotguns or Owen submachine guns. Every patrol carried claymore mines for ambushes. They had reliable radios for communication with headquarters and forward air controllers, and they had access to artillery support and helicopter evacuation if needed. But equipment alone doesn't explain effectiveness. The Viet Cong had access to AK-47 seconds, which were excellent weapons. They had explosives and mines. They had radio communication. What they lacked was the training and doctrine that allowed Australian SAS to use their equipment optimally. An AK-47 is only effective if you can detect the enemy in time to use it. Radio communication only helps if you survive long enough to call for support. The Australians consistently achieved first-shot advantage through superior reconnaissance and ambush procedures. The contrast with American operations was stark. American units in Vietnam typically operated with much larger formations. Company-sized patrols of 100 to 200 men were common. These large units required significant logistical support, made substantial noise during movement, and couldn't achieve the stealth necessary for reconnaissance operations in contested areas. Americans compensated with firepower. If a large American patrol encountered enemy resistance, they could call in massive fire support, artillery, gunships, fighter bombers. B-52 strikes if the target warranted it. This approach killed large numbers of Viet Cong fighters and disrupted their operations, but it didn't create the same psychological impact as Australian small unit tactics. When an American company moves through an area with helicopters overhead and artillery support on call, the Viet Cong response is to avoid contact, wait for the Americans to leave, and return afterward. The Americans dominate the area temporarily, but don't establish persistent presence. Against Australian SAS patrols, avoidance wasn't effective because you didn't know where the patrols were. You couldn't wait them out because they might be watching indefinitely. Some American units, particularly Special Operations Forces like the MACV SOG teams, did use tactics similar to the Australian SAS. Small patrols, deep reconnaissance, precision targeting. These units were also highly effective and feared by the Viet Cong, but they were a small fraction of American forces in Vietnam. The majority of American operations relied on conventional tactics that emphasized firepower over stealth. The Australian approach, particularly the SAS approach, was different from the start. It was built around the assumption that stealth and persistence would be more effective than overwhelming force. The woman whose experiences opened this narrative survived the war. After 1975, when North Vietnamese forces completed their conquest of South Vietnam, she was able to speak more openly about her wartime experiences. In interviews conducted decades later, she described the Australian period as the most difficult of her entire time in combat. She'd fought the French as a teenager. She'd fought Americans and South Vietnamese throughout the 1960s and early 70s. But the Australians, particularly the SAS, created a level of stress that exceeded anything else she'd experienced. She described one incident that stayed with her. Her unit had been assigned to secure a supply cache in a remote jungle area. They'd established the cache weeks earlier, carefully concealed, containing ammunition and medicine that would be critical for upcoming operations. They sent a team to retrieve supplies from the cache. The team never returned. After waiting the appropriate time, a search party went looking for them. They found the cache destroyed. Artillery had hit it with remarkable precision, directly on target. No survivors. The team that had been sent to retrieve supplies was dead, killed by the artillery strike or by small arms fire before the strike. The search party found evidence of a brief firefight, but no sign of who'd engaged the supply team. The obvious conclusion was that someone had been watching the cache, probably for days, waiting to see if anyone would approach it. When the supply team arrived, the observers had engaged them, killed or wounded them, and called in the artillery strike to destroy the cache. Then they'd left without leaving any clear traces. The entire operation was surgical. Identify the target, eliminate security, destroy the objective, withdraw. It was exactly how the Viet Cong would have conducted such a mission, but done to them, instead of by them. She said in the interview, "That was when I truly understood what we were facing. The Australians fought the way we fought, but they were better at it. They had better weapons, better support, better training, and they never stopped. Week after week, month after month, they were there, watching, waiting, killing us. We couldn't make them go away. We couldn't defeat them. All we could do was try to survive until they left. And we hated them for it. Not because they were cruel. They weren't particularly cruel by war standards. We hated them because they were effective. They beat us at our own methods. That's the worst kind of defeat." This assessment, echoed by other Viet Cong veterans in post-war interviews, explains why the Australian SAS became so feared and hated. It wasn't about atrocities or excessive violence. Australian forces in Vietnam maintained relatively strict discipline compared to some Allied forces. There were incidents, of course. No military force operates with perfect behaviour in combat, but systematic brutality wasn't the Australian approach. What made them hated was their effectiveness. They took the Viet Cong's own tactical advantages and negated them. The broader strategic impact of Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy Province is debated by military historians. Some argue that Australian methods were more effective than American approaches and that wider adoption of similar tactics might have changed the war's outcome. Others point out that the Australian task force operated in a single province with favourable geography and that their methods couldn't be scaled to cover all of South Vietnam. The American approach, relying on firepower and large unit operations, was necessary given the scale of the conflict and the political constraints under which American forces operated. Both perspectives have merit. The Australian methods were demonstrably effective in Phuoc Tuy Province. By 1969, the province was considered relatively secure compared to other contested areas. Viet Cong main force units had been badly degraded. Local guerrilla activity had decreased. The government's control over the population had increased. Australian operations, particularly SAS operations, contributed significantly to this outcome. But whether this success could have been replicated elsewhere is uncertain. What's clear is that at the tactical level, the Australian SAS achieved results far beyond what their numbers would suggest. Approximately 100 men in a squadron, perhaps 30 to 40 actually deployed in the field at any given time in four-man patrols, created psychological and operational effects on Viet Cong forces that exceeded the impact of much larger American units. They proved that in counterinsurgency warfare, how you fight matters more than how many soldiers you have. Stealth, patience, and precision can be more valuable than overwhelming firepower. The human cost on both sides was significant. 14 Australian SAS soldiers died in Vietnam. Each death represented the loss of a highly trained, experienced operator who'd survived rigorous selection and training. The impact on the small SAS community was profound. These weren't anonymous casualties in large battles. They were known individuals, often friends, whose deaths were felt personally throughout the regiment. Australian SAS placed enormous emphasis on recovering fallen comrades and ensuring no one was left behind. This commitment to their own people was absolute, even at considerable risk. The Viet Cong losses to Australian SAS operations were much higher numerically, but harder to quantify precisely. The estimated 500 killed is likely conservative. Many casualties were never confirmed because bodies were recovered by Viet Cong forces before Australian patrols could conduct battle damage assessment. Additionally, wounded fighters who died later from their injuries wouldn't be counted in immediate casualty figures. The psychological casualties, fighters whose morale and effectiveness declined due to stress and fear, can't be quantified at all, but were probably significant. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.